Okay, in this video, I am going to be demonstrating two guided paintings. We're going to work on them kind of simultaneously because watercolor takes a little bit to dry. And we're going to do an umbrella in the rain, and then we're also going to do this mountain scene with a cherry blossom tree. So the first thing that we're going to do, these are the photo references that we're going to use. We need to draw in preparation to paint. So I'm going to start by drawing my umbrella. Oh, just an FYI, I have taped my paper. This is watercolor paper that I have taped down to a board, and I have taped all the way around the edges to keep my paper from curling as I'm painting. So to start, you're going to draw with a pencil your umbrella. Now, if you have a hard time drawing it upside down, it just messes with your head, well, then draw it right side up and then flip your paper upside down after you're done drawing. To start with drawing this umbrella, it really looks like a half circle. So I'm going to start by drawing a half circle. And then I'm going to draw the skeleton of the umbrella. And then I can draw the rest of the umbrella, connecting the skeleton together. Now the handle needs to be straight out, kind of making a perpendicular line to everything. So it needs to be straight out from this point. So I like to kind of do a guide here just so I know where my handle is going to be. If this handle isn't straight, then the whole umbrella looks broken, it looks kind of weird, so let's make sure that we get our handle straight. Before I begin painting, I am going to do a little bit of pen work. And I highly recommend you use a ballpoint pen. We know that this doesn't bleed whenever it gets wet, which is important because we're going to be watercoloring these. Now, I like to do pen work on areas that are very detailed, usually with black. Black has a tendency to bleed and get a little bit messy whenever it comes to watercolor. So it's okay to cheat a little bit and use some pen work. So I'm doing a little bit of hatching. So I've outlined and now I'm adding a little bit of hatching just to add a little bit of dimension to my umbrella handle. I'm not going to do anything pen on the rest of the umbrella, however. It's just for the handle. All right. Now for this one, we are going to work on the background first. The background is very messy. It looks like we have wet on wets, and then we have maybe a little bit drier down here, but still pretty wet. And so I want to protect my umbrella with the masking fluid. So for this one, we're going to use some incredible white mask liquid frisket. I have it in a smaller bottle. Now this stuff really likes to ruin brushes, so we have to have our water nearby because we're going to have to rinse our brush quite often to keep this from damaging our brushes. So I'm just using a fairly small round brush for this, and I have this available, and then I also have my water nearby. I'm going to first get my brush wet. So as soon as this stuff dries, it ruins a brush, so we need to keep it from drying on the brush. So I'm going to get my brush wet first. And then I'm going to put some on my brush. Now I do not have to cover my entire umbrella. I just have to do the inside edge. So I do it for a couple seconds. Now I'm rinsing my brush, and then I'll get a little bit more and continue on. So every few seconds, I have to rinse my brush so I don't ruin my brush. All right, so I just did the interior edge. I don't have to do the whole thing. In fact, I shouldn't, because this stuff is very expensive, and that's just using excessive amounts of this stuff that we don't necessarily need to do. All right, so after I'm done with that, I'm going to make sure my lid is on tight so it doesn't spill, keeping everything secure. Now this has to dry before I paint, so that means that I'm going to move to my second painting and start setting that up. So for this one, we're going to have a mountain scene with a tree. Just to give you remember, it's going to look something like this. So we're going to start by drawing our mountains. Now our mountains are about 1/3 down, like our horizon line. We're going to use that rule of thirds. We're going to put our horizon line here where the mountains meet the water, about 1/3 down from the top. So that's the thing I'm going to start with first. I'm going to try to decide where my 1/3 mark is. And it doesn't have to be exact. This is not something that you have to measure. You just want to approximate and get it about 1/3 down. And then try to keep it straight. Whenever our lines are crooked or slanted, it often makes us feel like the world is like tilting and it causes us a little bit of anxiety. So try to get it a little bit straight as much as possible. So this is where the mountains are meeting the lake, okay? Now I did give you a reference, so we're going to use this as a reference. So I'm going to start drawing my mountains. Now remember, it's a reflection, so whatever I draw on the top of my line, I also have to mirror and draw on the bottom. That gets a little bit tricky. So if I draw part of a mountain here, I have to flip it and draw the same thing, just a mirror image reflecting in the water. It doesn't have to be perfect, so don't stress out about that symmetry. Just try to get it something looking similar. So I have 2 mountains. I'm going to add maybe one in the middle here. And I'm going to add a few more. The more complicated you make your mountains, the more complicated it is to make that symmetry happen. All right, so we have our mountains drawn. Now we're going to look at drawing our side hill that's kind of peeking into our foreground here. And then we'll draw some branches, our tree and some branches. We're not going to draw our leaves, those are going to be sponged on. So in my foreground, I'm going to have kind of a slanted hill here, kind of coming out of the corner. And then I'm going to draw a very organic, curly kind of tree. I don't know if trees can be curly, but I feel like it's kind of curly and curvy. The awesome thing about trees is you really don't mess up. The one thing to keep in mind though is that the branches should always get thinner. They should never get fatter. It just kind of breaks the law of trees, if there is a law of trees. Now we don't have to draw every single branch that we're going to paint, but I like to get something down just so I have an idea in my brain where my tree is going to be. And it's okay if your tree overlaps your mountains because your tree is going to be darker than your mountains, so it'll still work. All right, so after you get something drawn and you're okay with what it looks like, we can start painting our mountains. All right, so I'm going to bring my paint over here and I'm going to activate it. Remember, whenever we activate paint, we don't actually touch the water or our brush into the paint itself. We are just dripping some water in there first. Now I'm going to activate my blues. I did activate my black a little bit. I definitely am going to need my orange. I know that seems weird because we're not actually going to have orange mountains, but we're going to need it. All right, so activate your paint and then we're going to start mixing in our palette. All right, so I'm going to refer back to my photo again and we'll look at it. So if you notice, the mountains in the far back are the lightest, and there's this rule with watercolor that you always start with your lightest colors first and then you layer on top, okay? Darker colors will layer over lighter colors. So we're going to start with our lightest mountains first. And notice how at the top they're dark and then it fades out to a lighter blue. So we're going to use that graduated wash where we're fading it out. All right, so this blue is not a super bright blue. I'm going to get my blue in my palette, but I'm going to make it so it's not as intense. This is a pretty bright, intense blue. And to dull it down, we need to add its complement. So if I test this out on a test paper, that's a very, very bright blue, and it is not the same blue that's in my picture. Notice the intensity levels are a lot different. And what we do know about color theory is that if we add a little bit of its complement, that really changes the intensity. So I'm going to take a little bit of orange, and I'm going to add it to my blue. So I'm going to take a little bit of orange, add it to my blue in my palette, and then I'm going to test it. All right, so that really changed that blue. Now it's a very smoky blue. Now I think it went a little bit too smoky, so I'm going to add a little bit more blue back to it. Try to get the color that I want. That's more like what I want, okay? Now it's pretty dark, so I can add a little bit of water to it to lighten it up. And that's probably pretty good for our first mountains, which are our furthest away mountains. So take a little bit of time to get the color right before you start applying it to your paper. All right, so I'm going to start with my furthest mountains. So it's like I have a set of 2 here and a set of 2 here that I can do. I'm using a medium round brush for this. So I'm going to just put the blue, which is fairly light, at the top, and then I'm going to take a little bit of water in my brush and graduate that out. I do each mountain at a time. I don't want to put the blue on and then move on to my next one without blending it out, because it'll probably not blend when I get back to it. Okay, so now I'm going to do the mirror image of this, taking a little bit of water in my brush. Not tons of water. This is a very small section. So whenever I put water in my brush, I will also dab it off into the paper towel so I have a little bit more control. Watercolor is one of those things, because it is water, it's a little bit harder to control. So we just got to have smaller amounts of water in our brush to keep it where we need it. All right. So a common mistake that people make is that they'll get their first mountains done, and then they will move on to the next set of mountains before the first mountains dry. Well, the problem with that is our mountains are going to start bleeding together. Because this mountain touches this mountain, whatever I put here is going to bleed into that section. So we can't do that. We have to wait until this is dry before we can go ahead and start with our second mountains. All right, we're going to test to see if our masking fluid is dry over here. If it's not, we can always take a hair dryer. And so I touched it and a little bit got on my finger. Can you see that? So that means that that's not dry. It'll be sticky, but it shouldn't come up on your hands if you touch it. So this is not dry yet. So I'm going to take a hair dryer and I'm going to dry it so we can move on to our next step. Okay, so my masking fluid is now dry. So that means I can go ahead and start planning and doing my background. So this composition is monochromatic. It's one color plus grays and whites and blacks. And we're going to keep it that way. So our background is going to be just using black, but it's going to be very watered down. Black is, if we just do black, it's going to be too dark. So notice this is gray. It's kind of a lighter gray, and we're going to really try to lighten up our gray before we put it on there. So I'm going to start preparing my gray. Now to start, I'm going to take water and I'm going to put some water in my well. And I have a fairly large area, so I want to make sure that I mix up enough paint so I don't run out in the middle of doing this. So I'm going to fill that well. All right. Now I need to take some black. But I got to be careful. If I take too much black, it's going to get way too dark. So I put a little bit of black in that water, and it is pretty dark. Let's see. I'm going to make sure it wasn't just in my brush. So I want a gray that's not super dark to start with. I can always darken it up, but I can't make it lighter. So I want a gray that's fairly light, okay? Now it is going to be mixing with water, so that means that it will go on a little bit lighter, which is good. All right, now I'm going to use a bigger brush because I have a bigger area. And I'm going to do wet on wet until about here on my umbrella. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and just say, okay, this is where my destination is. And then it's going to shift as far as how much water I put on my paper. So I'm going to use this bigger brush and just put ample amounts of water on the surface. Now I'm going to do this in sections. So this is like my first section. And then I'm going to start and add some of my color. Now you want it to swirl around the paper and look very marbled. All right, now I'm going to move on to my next section. You'll notice that as you start adding more water, it'll start pulling. That's okay. It's okay to go right over your handle. Your handle should be darker than your background. If it's not, then you need to very much lighten up your color a little bit. So as far as the umbrella, we masked it off, so I don't have to worry too much about it going on my umbrella unless I paint directly over it. I can go right up to it and it will be protected from that masking. Now I do have spots that is starting to pool. If you don't like that, you can always blot some of that extra water off. And then you can put more color on. Have some variety of values in your background. It shouldn't just be one solid thing of gray. All right. So I'm getting to the point now where this is going to be less water. I want it to be a little bit more concentrated. I want to have a little bit more control over a little bit more control over where I put the color and how dark it is. It's not going to be as loose as the top. All right, so I want my color to be a little bit darker, and I'm going to use a smaller brush. I'm going to start with my shadow. So if you notice, I'm doing some lines. If you want it to look like water, you really need to have those horizontal lines in there. And this is a lot darker than what I had up here. I also want to make like little ripples as if it's raining. All right, so it looks a little bit more detailed compared to the top part, and that's what I want. I still have some pooling happening up here because the paper is a little bit rippled, and that's okay. I can dab some of that off. All right, so this is fairly wet up here, and so I need to let this dry before I move on to my next step, which is going to be removing some of or removing that masking and then working on the umbrella itself, okay? All right, so I can come back over here to my mountains. My mountains have been sitting there for a while. So that means that I can work on my next step, which is my next set of mountains. All right, so my next set of mountains should be a little bit darker. If you notice, as they get closer to us, they get a little bit darker. So my next set of mountains, which is going to be probably about here, are going to be a little bit darker. So I need to make my paint a little bit darker. That doesn't mean that I'm just going to add black to it. I want to have a little bit more color to it too. So I'm going to add a little bit more blue. And then I can test out my color and see what it looks like. So I don't want it just to be brighter. I want it to be more like darker, but not just black. So I'm going to add a little bit more blue and orange. And then I'm going to test it out and see where we're at. All right, so it's a little bit darker. It's like if I compare that to my other mountain, it is quite a bit darker, but I am going to be variegating it or graduating it, so it'll probably work out well. All right, so I'm going to take that blue that I just created and I'm going to put it at the top of my mountain, just like I did before. It's just a little bit darker. Put it there. And then I'm going to graduate that out. All right, so my next set of mountains are actually overlapping these mountains. They're touching those mountains. So I have to let this dry before I can move on to my final set of mountains. Okay, so my last set of mountains here are finally dry, and so now I can work on my last set of mountains. So I'm going to do that. Now this is my darkest set of mountains. There's definitely a lot darker mountain there than previous. So I'm going to intensify my colors a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit of blue. For this one, I might add a little tiny bit of black to make it a little bit darker. And as always, I have to test my color and make sure I like the color. So I am going to add more color to this. I can graduate it out, but I'm not going to have as much white on these last mountains because they're close to us, so the fog might not be as strong. Remember, try not to overwork. Whenever you overwork watercolor, typically what happens is it will start to ball up, like the paper will start to ball up, and you just will have like these little balls of paper, or it'll look kind of like you're stressing out the paper a little bit. So try to just like put the watercolor down and let it be, okay? So I have to let these last set of mountains dry before I can start looking at painting my tree and stuff like that. But we can move over here to our umbrella. So my background is dry, completely dry. So if I start removing my masking fluid, it's not going to tear my paper. If I do this before my background is completely dry, there is a chance that my paper will tear. So you got to make sure that you don't do that, okay? So I'm just carefully like rubbing this masking fluid off. It's like a skin that will peel off. To make sure that you have it all removed, just kind of rub your finger over and it should just feel smooth like paper. So we're going to do a red umbrella. I guess if you want to do a different color, you can, but make it bright, something that's bright and fun compared to the dreary background. So I'm going to mix up a red, but it's actually not going to be a pure, like a really dark red, intense red. It's going to start out pretty light. So again, just as a reminder, we start with our lightest layers first and then we layer over. So let's look at our picture. Notice in the picture that there's some lighter reds, and that's what we're going to start with. So we're going to put lighter reds over the entire thing, okay? We're going to be using the technique overlay for our umbrella. So I'm taking that red, which is more like a pink, I guess, and I'm putting it over the entire umbrella. All right, so that's my first layer of my umbrella. It looks pretty flat right now because there's no value. So we're going to start layering over and creating some value. All right, so my mountains over here are already dry, which is pretty exciting. We're going to start working on our hill with our tree. Where's my example? So our hill is going to be a toned down green, and then our tree is going to be different browns. So I'm going to start with the hill itself. Now, remember, as far as toning down colors, we always use our complement of that color. So I'm going to get some green going in my palette. But this green that's in my palette is super, super bright, very unrealistically bright. And I don't want to use that on my hill. So to tone it down, I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to add a little bit of red to it and see what happens. Now I do this little bits at a time. So I didn't do a whole lot of toning down with that first red adding, so I'm going to add a little bit more until I get my desired green. All right, so something like this is a little bit more realistic. It's not super, super bright. We don't want a really intense green. All right, for my green down here, all I'm going to do is take wet paint and put it on dry paper. And I'm really just doing one coat, and it's not anything fancy. This is a very light green for my first coat. I'm going to layer on top. All right, so that's my first coat of my green. Now if I start painting my tree down here, it is going to mix in with my green, and I don't want that. However, I can probably start painting some of my branches up here and work my way down this way. So that's what we're going to do, because my umbrella is not really ready for my next layer yet. So I'm going to start mixing brown. I will say this, that I am not a big fan of the brown that's in the pan automatically, that I would like to alter it. I can alter it by adding a little bit of black. I can add a little bit of red. I can add a little bit of green. So I just added a little bit of black to this, trying to get a different color brown. I'm going to see where my brown is. And I like that. That's a nice brown compared to the brown that was in it. So mix up a brown that you like, not necessarily one that's right out of the pan. I'm going to use a round brush for this. Use a round brush that you feel comfortable with. You may have to use a couple different sizes, maybe starting with a smaller one and then building up to a bigger one in the bigger spots. We want our branches to start out thin and then get thicker if we're starting in like right here. So I want it to start out thin and then it can get a little bit thicker as it comes out. So use a brush that will allow that to happen. This is just our first coat of brown. We are going to do some overlay to add a little bit of dimension to our tree. All right, so before I paint this part that goes into the green, I'm going to make sure that my green isn't wet so it doesn't start bleeding. And it is dry, so I can go ahead and start painting in that section. Always make sure that the surrounding areas are dry before you start painting them so you don't cause some problems where it starts bleeding together. All right, so that's my first layer on my tree. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll overlay with a little bit darker color so it will add a little bit of dimension to my tree so it doesn't look flat. All right, so we're going to pause with that one, and we're going to come back over to our umbrella and start adding our next layer. So our next layer needs to be a little bit darker, and we can look at this umbrella as a guide. So I'm going to mix up a red that's a little bit darker. So I'm going to take some red, and I'm going to add a little bit of green to it, and that should darken it up a bit. All right, so I added a little bit too much green and then darkened it up too much. So I'm going to balance that out with just adding red. All right, so that's a little bit darker compared to what I had before, and it looks a little bit more purple. All right, so we got to be careful on this one too. So we got to look at each section of our umbrella and make sure that we're not like overlapping sections that are wet, because we don't want them bleeding. So I'm going to put a little bit of this darker color here, and then I'm going to graduate that out, just using a little bit of water in my brush. I'm going to skip this one for now, because this one is right next to that one, and I'm afraid if I do that one, it will start bleeding together. So I'm going to skip that section and come to this one. Now I'm going to do this dark on both of the sides where the metal part of the umbrella is, and then I'm going to just graduate it towards the center so it'll blend out a little bit to the center. Okay, so I gotta let that dry before I start looking at these other two sections and adding on top of those two sections. I'm gonna come over here. All right, so my tree feels pretty dry, which is awesome. So I can start mixing up a little bit darker brown and add a little bit of dimension to the underparts of my tree. So I'm gonna add a little bit of black to the brown that I already have. All right, so I'm going to start, and so if you think about it, the sun is always, above. So that means that the below parts is where I'm going to add some of these darker values. So kind of like the underside of the branches. So I'm going to add a little bit of the darker value, and then I'm going to take a little bit of water to graduate it out, just to blend it out very slightly. I'm not overworking again. I'm using a fairly small detail brush for this because it's small little areas. You always have to adjust what size brush you use depending on the area that you're painting. Okay, so my tree now doesn't look nearly as flat as it did, which is pretty awesome. I'm going to add a little bit of thickness here. I'm just noticing that this part is really thick, and so just, I don't want to have parts that are thicker up above than below. So I'm going to add a little bit more thickness down here and maybe thicken up the trunk a little bit. All right, so I feel that my tree has more dimension than what it did before. Maybe certain parts need a little bit more dimension, but at least I don't have just one value on my branches, so I'm liking it a little bit better now. Oops, that's okay. That'll be covered up by whenever I start sponging. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of stuff down here. So I feel like we need to have maybe some textures, maybe some lines, kind of indicating that there's like some things growing down here. And I'm going to do that with greens. But I want them to be a little bit darker than the green that I had already. All right, so that green looks pretty good. So I'm going to just draw some things growing. So using this is like a wet on dry technique. I'm adding some weeds, some grasses, kind of by the tree. Oops, that got a little bit out of hand there. So I'm going to kind of blot that off a little bit. So you kind of decide where you want your little plants growing here. I have just different textures. So I have some line texture, but then I have some just kind of, it's almost like scribble scrabble, kind of just a rough texture, adding a little bit more realism to my green area down there. All right, so I'm going to let this be. So our next step is going to be sponging on for our cherry blossoms. And so we're going to let that dry a little bit, and we can come back to our umbrella, which is nearing the finish line here. All right, so I added to here, but I didn't add to these two sections last time. So I'm going to add a little bit of that same dark color that I had before to this section, and then I'm going to graduate that out. And then I'm going to look at this section. This is my darkest section over here. So I'm going to add quite a bit of this darker color. And then I'm also anticipating adding even darker colors over here. So this is actually just going to be filled in, this one. All right, so a couple more layers on this umbrella on our two darker sections will probably finish that one off. But we gotta wait. We always have to wait. All right, so for our final step on our tree here, we're going to add some sponging. Okay, we're going to sponge on some of our cherry blossom color. Typically cherry blossoms are like kind of a pinkish color, so that's what I'm going to go with. Now you can be as artistic as you want to be, and if you want it to be not pink, then you use the color that you desire. All right, so mine is going to be very light to begin with, and I can add different layers on top as well. I don't have to sponge just once. So I'm going to get my sponge a little bit damp. It's pretty crusty, and it's a very small sponge, so I have some control over where I'm putting my stuff. And I've mixed up kind of this lighter pink color that I'm going to start with for my first layer. And so I'm just going to put my sponge in it, and then I'm not pressing very hard. I don't want to reactivate the paint that's below it with the browns, so I'm barely just even touching the paper with my sponge. Now you're going to notice that your color disappears very, very fast. That sponge absorbs it. Like my color that I mixed is pretty much gone. It's kind of annoying. Out here I can add a little bit more and press a little bit harder. All right, so I need to mix up more color. Notice how my color, which was there, is gone. All right, so I can add a little bit more and just keep layering it on until you get the amount of color that you want. So I feel like that one is pretty much done, so I can let that dry. Now let's come back to our umbrella and let's do our finishing touches on our umbrella. So I'm going to mix up a darker red. Now this could be, you can do like red with some black, you could do red with some purple. If you look at the picture that I provided, it does look like it has some purple in it. So you kind of decide how you want to go dark with this. So I just added just a tiny bit of black to my red and it went way too dark. So I'm going to counter that by adding more red to it. So we want this to be our darkest layer. So that is definitely darker than what I had before, okay? So I'm going to add that to my darkest section. And I'm really just going to paint that whole section with this. All right, so that kind of looks like that's the underside. Now I'm going to add a little bit of that in this other section, and then I'm going to graduate it out. And I really feel like now my umbrella has a lot more dimension than what it had before. Now the last step that I like to do is I like to take a pen and add little tiny little balls at the end of my umbrella. So we can do that, but I would want to wait until it's dry. I can probably do it over here where I haven't painted recently. So I like to go and add these little things. It's just like kind of a finishing touch. All right, so those are our two guided paintings.